For more on the legality of drones, we're joined here in our Washington, D.C. studio by Christine Fair. She's an assistant professor in the Security Studies program at Georgetown University, right here in Washington. From London, we're joined by investigative journalist Chris Wood. He's the author of the book Sudden Justice, America's Secret Drone Wars. Also here with us in the studio is Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. He served as Chief of Staff for U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Christine, let me start with you. Is the U.S. drone program, also known as Targeted Killings, a legal program?
Okay, well, that's a sweeping question. To be completely blunt, I can't answer that question as you've asked it. I can speak to the drone program in Pakistan, and one of the critical junctures in understanding its legality is understanding the degree to which the Pakistani government cooperates. If the Pakistani government did not cooperate, there would obviously be some fairly serious issues under IHL, International Humanitarian Law. But it's impossible that the Pakistani government doesn't cooperate. After all, they own the airspace. If they were not deconflicting the airspace, there would be all sorts of problems, and the Pakistani government is providing intelligence. So there is a degree, a significant degree, in fact, of Pakistani cooperation. There's also another interesting question, legal according to what code of law. What I think is actually kind of interesting from an American point of view is that for the last several years, I mean, because we basically have depleted the al-Qaeda target set, we mostly have been killing Pakistani Taliban. And you have to stretch the definition of al-Qaeda, and you have to stretch the definition of Taliban considerably to have those individuals fall, what I think, comfortably under the 2001 authorization for the use of military force. So there might be this really interesting question where it's legal in one sense, but it's really skirting very close to being illegal under U.S. law, given the people that we've been targeting with this drone program.
Right, let's go to Chris Wood in London. Chris, I want to read you something that the U.S. network NBC News reported in March. It said a confidential Justice Department memorandum concludes that the U.S. government can order the killing of American citizens if they're believed to be senior operational leaders of al-Qaeda or an associated force, even if there is no intelligence indicating they're engaged in any active plot to attack the United States. That is the U.S. legal justification for these attacks.
Just on the broader point, most drone strikes actually take place on the conventional battlefield, where they're covered by the laws of war and conventional conflict. It's pretty straightforward. They are illegal. So what we're talking about here is a subset of drone strikes in places like Pakistan, Somalia, and Yemen, where strikes are taking place away from the hot battlefield. And I would disagree with Christine in terms of the legality. The consent of nations, it's not clear at all that even with the consent of a nation like Yemen or Pakistan, that would make a drone strike on their territory lawful outside of a hot war. And certainly that's been the UN's position since 2002 when these secret strikes first began. I would definitely agree, though, that there's been a big shift in who is being targeted. And really, since 2008, 2009, the American drone campaign in Pakistan has really been an extension of the war in Afghanistan. And there are big question marks about whether the original authorization for force, the AUMF passed back in 2001, still applies. That's a view shared, by the way, by many senior officials in both the intelligence and military communities in the United States. So, is the United States entitled to assassinate senior members of al-Qaeda? It claims so. Internationally, that view is disputed. Most members of the United Nations would disagree with that view.
Colonel, what is the situation regarding the U.S. war against al-Qaeda? Because the critics of the drone program say that that is not a war that is recognized in international law. Therefore, we have these strikes against Yemen, Pakistan, Somalia. Does that violate international law?
I've got to address the issues that the two previous speakers brought up, I think, in addition to trying to answer your question. I think, I'm not a lawyer, due diligence too, my son is a Reaper drone squadron commander involved in their use on the battlefield right now. I think there are four huge components to drone use that we have not addressed adequately. The first is the one we've already talked about. International and domestic law lags their use. Second is what I call the ethics of it. That lags their use also. And as a component of that, and very much of concern to me as a soldier, is the warrior ethic, which most Americans don't even know what I'm talking about when I mention. There's a wonderful piece by a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force named Jason Armagast that explains this. You destroy the warrior ethic when you murder for the state, which is essentially what you're doing when you are totally immune from being reacted to in your actions. And then the last component is an efficacy component brought to the attention of everyone in the Pentagon when Donald Rumsfeld in 2004, then Secretary of Defense, asked the question of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, tell me how we're winning if every time we kill 3, they grow 10 more as a result of our killing them. This is a huge component of the argument that no one really talks about.
And the legality of the strikes?
I'm not a lawyer, so I can't say, except that I did do a lot of research into this when I was in the military in terms of air defense identification zones, neutrality, war, the law of war, and so forth. You can't fly across an air defense identification zone of a country with whom you're not at war and kill people in that country under international law. And to say, as we do in Somalia, that the current government in Mogadishu is the government of Mogadishu and has given us permission is a little bit ludicrous.
That's a stretch. Christine?
Well, actually, so, I mean, I don't want to be seen as someone who's making blanket statements about the legality of drones. I'm not a lawyer, and I would never make those kinds of claims. But I will say that the two views of the other speakers does project the idea that this is black and white. There has been an enormous volume of scholarly literature about this, and particularly when in the case of Pakistan and the case of Yemen, where there has been government consensus, it is simply not the case that it is clearly black and white that they are illegal. So I think this is still an issue of considerable legal debate. So I think we should push back a little bit that this is as clear as the previous two people have indicated. If it were so
this
clear,
debate's healthy as far as I'm concerned. It's healthy.
I think
it should be happening.
I think there should be a debate. I'm simply saying that this is not as black and white as has been projected.
Yeah, I just want to say this question of distance, it is an issue in warfare, particularly for advanced militaries being further and further away from the targets. And it's not just about drones, but there's something specific about drones. And one issue we often talk about drones being risk-free for the United States or Britain or Israel, the 3 countries that presently have armed drones. There is an issue of that violence being displaced onto local populations, particularly onto local militaries and onto local police. The Taliban, for example, in Pakistan or Al-Qaeda in Yemen will often retaliate against those they can reach, which will be local security forces. And we've seen atrocities carried out in Sana'a and throughout Pakistan, for example. So the idea that this is risk-free warfare, it's risk-displaced warfare. We may feel safer, but those populations may not be safer. And I think that's something we should talk about. But Christine has a point. Distance is an issue, and that distance from the enemy carries consequences that I don't think we fully understand yet. It's a form of warfare, particularly around armed drone use, that we don't really understand. And the efficacy, as Professor Wilkerson said, we don't know how effective the campaign in Pakistan is going to be in the long term. It's certainly been effective at suppressing Al-Qaeda. How effective it is in the long term, we don't know. And certainly for President Obama to say it's the new model for Iraq and Syria, as he just has done, because we've done so well in Yemen. Well, they haven't done well in Yemen. I mean, Yemen's a bit of a mess. I'm not laying that at the feet of the United States alone, but its involvement there only with drones and airstrikes is, in my view, part of the problem, not really part of the solution right now.
So I want to just address the displaced violence, because I think he makes a really interesting point. But there's also another issue, and I'm going to this is only speaking to Pakistan, where I have, as you know, considerable expertise. The drone strikes are localized to the federally administered tribal areas where there are no local police. So, you know, we can have a debate about the legality of the drone strikes.
Well, there are the Qasada, Christine. There are local militia.
No, the Qasadars are not police. Police conduct arrests. Police collect evidence. They file FIRs.
And there's the Frontier Constabulary.
So the Frontier Constabulary is also not police. The Frontier Constabulary is a paramilitary force with no police training.
I'm aware of that.
If you are aware of that, let me finish my point. Let me finish my point.
Christine, outside the United States, paramilitary is often...
Chris, I'll come to you in a moment, Chris.
My point is that there are Qasadars and there are also Lashkars. These are called militias. Frontier Constabulary is a paramilitary force. None of these organizations have the power of arrest, the collection of evidence, the ability to file an FIR, which has any standing in Pakistani courts, because Pakistani courts have no standing in FATA because it has a unique constitutional standing. So my question is, the people who live in this area and I'm sure Chris Woods knows this, there is a very large number of Pashtuns who live in the proximity of the militant groups themselves who actually welcome the drones because they say the Pakistan military cannot protect us without enormous displacement and enormous civilian casualties. So the only alternative is to do nothing. For the people who live closest to the drones, many of these people, and I know them from Waziristan, call them ababil, which were the little swallows that dropped stones upon the Lashkar of the army of elephants that were staging the Kaaba in the Quran. I mean, so this is an important alternative view.
Just one moment. I'll be with you right now. We're going to have to take a break. I will come up with, we want to talk about the effectiveness of the drone attacks as well as how information is gathered in these places. But we're going to take a break right now.